The people who give away the most often look like they have the least. The little boy ran through the freezing Boston rain with both hands wrapped around a cardboard box of milk cartons, his sneakers splashing through puddles that reflected the pale yellow glow of the streetlights. The wind howled between the narrow brick buildings, sharp and cold enough to make grown men hurry home, but the child kept smiling as if he were carrying treasure. Taped to the top of the box was a small white note written in neat handwriting. From Clara. 2 blocks away, inside Blackstone Grill, warmth and money filled the air together. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath golden lights. Expensive watches flashed every time someone lifted a bourbon glass. The scent of grilled ribeye and roasted garlic drifted through the crowded dining room, while quiet jazz played somewhere behind the conversations about mergers, private equity, and million-dollar contracts. Clara Bennett moved through the restaurant almost invisibly. Black uniform, white apron, hair tied back in a simple low ponytail. Nothing about her invited attention, and maybe that was why most people never really looked at her. She carried plates with calm precision, weaving through crowded tables with the quiet grace of someone who had learned long ago how to make herself smaller than the room around her. But if anyone had watched carefully, they would have noticed the little things. The way she slipped untouched bread rolls into small paper bags near the kitchen exit. The way she folded every dollar bill from her tips separately before placing them into a plain envelope hidden inside her apron pocket. The way exhaustion lived behind her soft blue eyes, even when she smiled politely and asked if anyone needed another refill. At the center table, near the windows, sat Ethan Cole. 40 stories above the city was his office. Half the buildings outside belonged to companies he had bought, sold, or buried. At 38, the CEO of Cole Technologies had become the kind of man people lowered their voices around. His charcoal suit looked tailored directly onto his body. A silver Swiss watch rested against his wrist like another symbol of power. Even silence seemed expensive around him. 3 investors laughed at something he had just said, while Clara carefully placed fresh coffee beside his plate. Ethan barely looked at her. "Thank you," she said softly after setting down the cup. He nodded once, distracted by the tablet glowing in his hand. Numbers, contracts, profit projections, the language he trusted most. Clara turned to leave, but one of the younger executives stopped her with a smirk. "Hey, Clara," he said loudly enough for the table to hear. "How many jobs do you work exactly?" A few chuckles followed. Clara paused politely. "Just this one, sir." "Really?" the man laughed. "Then why do you dress like you're saving every penny for the apocalypse?" More laughter. Quiet, sharp, comfortable laughter from people who had never worried about rent in their lives. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment, still holding the empty coffee pot against her chest. "I guess I just don't need very much," she answered gently. Ethan finally looked up then. His gray eyes moved across her worn black shoes for exactly half a second before he leaned back in his chair. "Some people are simply born to stay small," he said casually before taking another sip of coffee. The table laughed harder this time. Not cruel enough to sound evil, just careless enough to hurt. Clara stood completely still. No anger crossed her face. No embarrassment either. Only that same calm expression she wore every night. Then she smiled softly. "Maybe," she said. "Excuse me." And she walked away. Ethan watched her disappear behind the kitchen doors. Something about her lack of reaction irritated him more than if she had argued back. Most people either tried to impress him or resented him. Clara had done neither. She simply moved on as though his opinion carried no weight at all. Outside, rain slammed harder against the windows. Inside, dinner service continued. Plates arrived. Deals were discussed. Whiskey glasses emptied and refilled. Nearly an hour later, Ethan stood near the hostess station scrolling through emails when he realized he had left an important folder inside the private dining room upstairs. Muttering under his breath, he headed back through the quiet hallway while employees cleaned tables around him. The restaurant had nearly emptied by then. Chairs rested upside down on tables. Lights dimmed one section at a time. Ethan grabbed the folder and started back toward the exit when he noticed movement through the side window, facing the alley behind the building. Clara stood alone beneath the rain awning near the back entrance. She looked smaller outside somehow, wrapped in an oversized gray coat with raindrops glimmering along her sleeves. In her hands was the plain envelope from earlier. A woman in her 60s approached slowly from the sidewalk, holding a broken umbrella. Clara immediately pressed the envelope into her hands. "Please," Clara whispered gently, her breath visible in the cold air. "Don't tell the children where it came from." The older woman's eyes filled instantly with tears. "Clara, you already gave too much this month." Clara shook her head softly. "They need the milk before Friday." Ethan stood frozen behind the glass. The rain blurred the scene slightly, but not enough to hide what he had just witnessed. The older woman hugged the envelope tightly against her chest, while Clara stepped backward into the storm before the woman could say anything else. Then, without noticing Ethan watching from the shadows inside the restaurant, Clara pulled her coat tighter around herself and disappeared into the cold Boston rain alone. The next morning, Boston woke beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Rainwater still clung to the sidewalks. Taxis hissed through puddles. Steam rose from subway grates like ghosts escaping the city below. Clara Bennett stepped out of the Green Line station just after 6:30 in the morning with a paper cup of black coffee warming her hands. Her coat was too thin for November weather, but she walked quickly, shoulders relaxed, as though she had trained herself not to notice discomfort anymore. Around her, the financial district slowly came alive. Men in tailored overcoats hurried toward glass towers with wireless earbuds pressed into their ears. Delivery trucks rattled against the curb. Somewhere down the block, a saxophone player performed for commuters who barely looked up. Clara paused outside a small bakery before work. Not to buy anything, just to smile at the elderly owner setting fresh muffins into the display case. "Morning, Miss Clara," he called warmly through the cracked doorway. "Morning, Mr. Levin. You eating breakfast today?" She lifted her coffee slightly. "This counts." The old man frowned. "Coffee is not breakfast." Clara smiled softly. "It is if you are late." He disappeared inside for a moment before returning with a blueberry muffin wrapped in napkins. On the house, Clara hesitated. "You really do not have to. And you really do not know how to say no when someone is trying to help you." Her eyes lowered briefly. Then she accepted it with both hands. "Thank you. You helped my granddaughter with her math for 3 months," he said. "Let an old man give you a muffin." Clara laughed quietly and continued down the sidewalk. The sound was soft, genuine, the kind of laugh that disappeared almost as soon as it arrived. 40 minutes later, Ethan Cole sat inside the back seat of his black Escalade while the city blurred past the tinted windows. His assistant spoke rapidly through the speakerphone about investor concerns and quarterly projections, but Ethan barely listened. Instead, he kept seeing the image from the night before. Clara standing in the rain. The envelope. The way she had walked away before accepting gratitude. It made no sense to him. People always wanted something. Recognition. Leverage. Credit. That was how the world worked. Even generosity usually came with cameras attached to it. Yet there had been nothing performative about Clara. No audience. No social media post. No expectation. Just quiet sacrifice disappearing into the dark. "Mr. Cole," his assistant repeated. Ethan blinked. "What?" The board meeting was moved to 10:30. "Fine." Silence settled again inside the SUV. His driver adjusted the mirror carefully before speaking. "Everything all right, sir?" Ethan looked out at the crowded streets. "Do you think people can actually be selfless?" The driver looked surprised. "Some people, maybe." Ethan gave a quiet scoff. "Nobody gives away money they need. Depends what matters more to them." Ethan did not answer. Blackstone Grill was quieter during lunch hours. Sunlight spilled softly through the tall windows while waiters polished glasses and jazz music floated low through hidden speakers. Clara moved between tables with the same calm rhythm as always. Refill coffee. Clear plates. Smile politely. Keep moving. But today, Ethan watched her differently. He noticed details he had ignored before. The careful stitching on her worn apron where it had been repaired by hand. The tiny notebook she carried in her pocket filled with grocery lists and numbers. The way she never wasted food. The way every busboy, dishwasher, and hostess relaxed slightly around her presence. She treated everyone exactly the same. Around noon, a young dishwasher named Miguel accidentally dropped an entire tray of clean glasses near the kitchen entrance. The crash echoed through the restaurant. Silence followed instantly. The manager stormed forward already angry. "Do you realize how much those cost?" Miguel's face drained of color. "I am sorry. I am really sorry. Sorry does not replace crystal glassware." Clara stepped between them before the manager could continue. It was slippery near the sink, she said gently. I almost fell there earlier too. The manager exhaled sharply. Then someone should mop it properly. He walked away muttering under his breath. Miguel stood frozen beside the shattered glass. Thank you, he whispered. Clara crouched beside him carefully. Are your hands okay? He nodded. You should not have defended me. Clara offered him a small smile while gathering broken pieces into a dustpan. Everybody needs someone to stand beside them sometimes. Ethan watched the entire exchange from his corner booth without touching his food. Something uncomfortable tightened slowly inside his chest. He remembered every employee he had publicly embarrassed over the years for mistakes smaller than broken glasses. Fear improved efficiency. That was what he always believed. Yet watching Clara, he realized something unsettling. People did not fear her at all, and somehow they still wanted to do better around her. Later that afternoon, Clara stepped outside through the alley entrance for her 10-minute break. The wind had turned colder. She sat quietly on an overturned milk crate near the brick wall and unwrapped half of the blueberry muffin from earlier that morning. Before she could take a bite, movement caught her attention. A homeless man stood near the dumpster rubbing his hands together against the cold. Clara looked down at the muffin for 1 second. Then she stood and walked toward him without hesitation. Sir. The man looked startled. Clara held out the napkin gently. You should eat something warm today. Miss, you do not have to do that. I know. Her smile was small but steady. Please take it anyway. From the second-floor office window above the alley, Ethan Cole stood completely still, watching her again in silence while snowflakes began falling softly over the city for the first time that winter. Snow fell quietly across Boston through most of the evening, softening the sharp edges of the city until even the traffic sounded distant and tired. Inside Blackstone Grill, warm light reflected against polished wood and crystal glasses, while customers escaped the cold with expensive wine and slow conversations. Clara Bennett balanced 3 plates carefully along one arm as she crossed the dining room. Her movements remained calm despite the rush around her. No wasted motion. No frustration. Just the same quiet rhythm she carried every night. But tonight, Ethan Cole noticed everything. He noticed how Clara always served older customers first because they took longer to settle comfortably into their seats. He noticed how she memorized regular orders without writing them down. He noticed the way exhausted parents relaxed whenever she spoke gently to their children instead of pretending they were inconvenient. Small things. Invisible things. The kind most people overlooked because they did not generate profit reports or headlines. Ethan sat alone near the back window with untouched scotch resting beside his hand. His laptop remained open, glowing with emails demanding his attention, but he barely looked at the screen anymore. Across the restaurant, Clara knelt beside an elderly customer struggling to hear the menu over the noise. She repeated every item patiently without showing the slightest irritation. The old woman touched Clara's hand gratefully before ordering soup and tea. Ethan frowned slightly. Why did she do that? Not the job itself. Plenty of people worked hard. Plenty of people smiled professionally. But Clara carried herself differently. There was no calculation behind it. No performance. It was as if kindness had become instinctive to her, even when nobody rewarded it. You are staring again. Ethan looked up sharply. His business partner, Richard Lawson, slid into the booth across from him with a grin. I am observing. Richard smirked. You have been observing that waitress for 3 days. Ethan leaned back. There is something strange about her. You mean attractive? Ethan's expression hardened immediately. That is not what I said. Richard raised both hands innocently. Relax. I am joking. Ethan glanced back toward Clara. She gives away money she clearly needs. Defends employees who cannot help her career. Feeds strangers. Richard shrugged. Maybe she wants people to think she is a saint. No, the answer came too quickly. Ethan stared at the melting ice in his glass. If she wanted attention, she would not hide it. Richard studied him for a moment. That bothers you, does it not? Ethan did not respond. Because it did bother him. More than he wanted to admit. He had built an empire understanding human motivation. Greed. Ambition. Fear. Ego. Every negotiation eventually revealed what people truly wanted. But Clara Bennett felt like a language he could not translate. Across the room, a customer suddenly raised his voice at one of the younger servers after receiving the wrong steak temperature. The young waitress looked close to tears while apologizing repeatedly. Before the situation escalated further, Clara quietly stepped in beside her. "I am very sorry, sir," Clara said calmly. "I will personally fix this for you right away." The man sighed angrily. This place used to know what medium rare means. Clara nodded once. "You are right to expect better. No defensiveness. No argument. Just calm accountability." The customer's shoulders lowered almost immediately. "Fine," he muttered. "Thank you." Clara disappeared into the kitchen with the plate, while the younger waitress exhaled shakily. "I thought he was going to complain to management." Clara touched her shoulder gently. "Everyone has difficult days. You always say that." Clara offered a faint smile. "Because it is usually true." Ethan watched her through the reflection of falling snow outside the windows. Most people absorbed tension and returned it sharper. Clara somehow softened it instead. An hour later, Ethan stepped outside to take a phone call from New York investors. Cold air hit his face instantly. Snowflakes drifted beneath the streetlights in slow spirals, while traffic crawled through the slush-covered streets. "No," Ethan said sharply into the phone. "Delay the acquisition until legal finishes the review." He paced near the alley beside the restaurant, frustration tightening his voice. "I do not care what the shareholders want tonight. They can wait until Monday." The call ended with tension still burning behind his eyes. He rubbed his forehead tiredly before noticing movement farther down the alley. Clara stood near the back steps again, bundled inside her gray coat. But this time she was not alone. A teenage girl sat beside her wrapped in a thin blanket, shivering badly against the cold. Clara held a steaming paper cup carefully between the girl's hands. "Drink slowly," Clara whispered. "It is hot." "I am okay," the girl murmured weakly. Clara's expression softened with quiet sadness. Nobody says they are okay while shaking that hard. Ethan stayed hidden near the corner of the building without understanding why he did not walk away. The teenager stared down at the cup. "The shelter is full tonight." Clara nodded slowly. Snow gathered along her hair and shoulders while she listened. Really listened. Not impatiently. Not distracted. "Do you have family nearby?" The girl shook her head. Silence settled for a moment except for the wind moving between buildings. Then Clara carefully removed her own gloves and handed them over. "Take these." "No, I cannot." "Yes, you can. But your hands will freeze." Clara smiled gently. "I work inside." The girl's eyes filled with tears she clearly did not want anyone to see. Clara pretended not to notice. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out folded cash. Maybe $40. Maybe more. Nearly an entire shift's worth of tips. "There is a 24-hour diner 3 blocks east," Clara said softly. "Stay there tonight until the storm slows down." "Why are you helping me?" The question barely rose above the wind. Clara looked toward the falling snow for one long, quiet second before answering. "Because somebody once helped me." Ethan stood completely still beneath the dim alley light, while something unfamiliar settled heavily inside his chest. Guilt. Not sharp guilt. Worse. Quiet guilt. The kind that arrived slowly and refused to leave. By Friday evening, the snowstorm had passed, but the cold remained trapped inside the city like something heavy and lingering. Boston glowed beneath thousands of lights while people hurried through downtown wrapped in scarves and expensive coats, desperate to escape the freezing wind. Inside Blackstone Grill, warmth returned in layers. Candlelight flickered softly against wine glasses. The low sound of piano music drifted through the restaurant, while wealthy guests celebrated deals, anniversaries, and promotions they would probably forget within a week. Clara Bennett tied her apron carefully behind her back before stepping onto the floor for another shift. Her fingertips were red from the cold despite standing near the kitchen heat for almost 20 minutes. She flexed them quietly once before picking up her order pad. "You look exhausted," said Lily, another waitress, while polishing silverware beside her. Clara smiled faintly. "I am all right." Lily tilted her head. "You always say that right before you nearly fall asleep, standing up." Clara laughed softly under her breath. "Then I should probably avoid standing still." But even as she joked, dark circles rested beneath her eyes. She had worked 6 shifts in a row, double shifts twice this week. Yet somehow she still carried herself with that same calm steadiness, as if fatigue had become just another thing she quietly carried without complaint. Across the restaurant, Ethan Cole entered with 3 investors trailing behind him. Conversations subtly shifted the moment he walked in. People recognized him instantly. Power had a way of changing the temperature of a room. Ethan removed his charcoal coat slowly while scanning the dining area almost automatically. And there she was. Clara stood near the hostess station speaking gently to an elderly couple about gluten-free menu options. The old woman smiled warmly at something Clara whispered before squeezing her hand gratefully. Ethan found himself watching the interaction longer than necessary. "You are doing it again," Richard muttered beside him. Ethan frowned. "Doing what?" "Looking at her like you were trying to solve a puzzle." Ethan ignored him and slid into the booth near the center of the restaurant. Clara approached moments later with menus tucked against her chest. "Good evening," she said softly. "Can I start anyone with sparkling water or wine?" One of the investors looked her up and down dismissively before answering. "House red." Another barely acknowledged her presence at all. Ethan studied her face carefully while she wrote the orders down. Calm, polite, tired, but still kind. "And for you, Mr. Cole?" Clara asked. Ethan glanced toward the dark circles beneath her eyes. "Coffee." Clara blinked once. "Coffee. Black. Of course." She disappeared toward the kitchen while the investors exchanged amused looks. "Coffee on a Friday night." Richard laughed. "You planning to work until sunrise again?" Ethan barely heard him. Something else had caught his attention. Clara moved more slowly tonight. Not dramatic. Most people would never notice. But Ethan did. When she returned with the drinks 10 minutes later, a customer near the entrance suddenly snapped his fingers impatiently at her. "Mississippi, we have been waiting 15 minutes for bread." Clara immediately turned toward the table. "I am so sorry. I will bring it right away." "This place gets slower every week," the man muttered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Clara nodded once without defending herself. "I understand the frustration." She hurried toward the kitchen while Ethan watched quietly. "You know," one investor said casually while cutting into his steak, "people like her are lucky jobs like this still exist. Half these restaurants will replace servers with tablets eventually." Richard chuckled. Cold, but probably true. Ethan looked down at his untouched coffee. 3 days ago, he would have agreed without hesitation. Efficiency mattered. Emotions complicated business. That was the philosophy that built his empire. But now, for reasons he could not fully explain, the conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth. 20 minutes later, Clara passed by their table carrying 2 heavy trays balanced carefully along both arms. A little girl around 6 years old accidentally ran across her path chasing a dropped crayon. Clara reacted instantly, twisting sideways just enough to protect the child from the hot plates. One tray tilted sharply. A glass shattered against the floor. Red wine splashed across the edge of Ethan's tablecloth. Silence hit the dining room immediately. Clara froze. "I am so sorry," she whispered, breathing hard. The little girl stared up at her with frightened eyes while hiding behind her mother's chair. "Are you hurt?" Clara asked the child first instead of the guests. The girl shook her head slowly. "Okay," Clara said gently. "That is what matters." The manager stormed across the room, already furious. "Clara, this is the second incident this week." "It was my fault," the child's mother interrupted quickly. "My daughter was running." But the manager barely listened. "We cannot afford mistakes during peak hours." Clara lowered her eyes. "I understand." Ethan looked at the broken glass near his shoes, then at Clara's trembling hands. Something tightened painfully inside his chest again. Not pity. Something heavier. Shame. Because suddenly he remembered every moment he had mocked her simple life. Every careless comment. Every assumption. And standing there beneath the golden restaurant lights, exhausted and apologizing for protecting a child, instead of protecting expensive dishes, Clara somehow looked stronger than anyone else in the room. Ethan stood slowly. The movement drew every eye toward him. The manager straightened immediately. "Mr. Cole, I assure you this will be handled." Ethan's voice remained calm. "Handled how?" The manager hesitated. "Well, company policy." Ethan glanced toward the little girl still clutching her crayon with shaky fingers. Then back at Clara. "She prevented a child from getting burned by hot plates." Silence. Heavy and complete. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his platinum card, and placed it quietly on the table. "Charge me for the glasses." Clara looked up sharply, surprised. Ethan met her eyes for one long moment. "Accidents happen." The manager opened his mouth to argue, then stopped himself immediately. Around them, conversations slowly resumed. Glasses clinked again. Piano music returned softly to the background. But Clara remained still for a second longer, staring at Ethan with quiet confusion, as though she no longer recognized the same man who once laughed at her for living small. The moment stayed with Ethan Cole long after the restaurant emptied that night, even after the last customer left. Even after the candles were extinguished one by one and the sound of dishes faded into silence behind the kitchen doors. Clara Bennett's trembling hands. The frightened little girl clutching her crayon. The way Clara apologized for the broken glasses while making sure the child was unharmed first. Most people protected money before people. That was the world Ethan understood. Yet somehow Clara always reversed the order without hesitation. Snow drifted softly outside as Ethan stood alone near the window of his penthouse apartment overlooking the Charles River. The city lights shimmered beneath the dark sky, while jazz music played quietly from hidden speakers. Expensive art lined the walls. Imported marble reflected warm light across floors large enough to echo footsteps. Everything about the apartment represented success, power, achievement. Yet tonight the silence inside it felt strangely cold. Ethan loosened his tie slowly and stared at his untouched glass of bourbon. Then he reached for his phone. "Mara," he said when his assistant answered sleepily. "I need information on someone." "At midnight." "Tomorrow morning, then." A pause. "Who?" Ethan looked out toward the snow-covered skyline. "Clara Bennett." "The waitress?" Ethan frowned slightly. "How do you know she is a waitress?" Mara laughed quietly. "Because you have never asked me to research anyone who was not a competitor or a board member." Ethan ignored the comment. "Just find out where she sends her money." Silence lingered briefly on the line. "That sounds personal." "It is not." "Of course." By Saturday afternoon, Mara placed a thin folder carefully across Ethan's desk inside Cole Technologies headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed downtown Boston beneath pale winter sunlight, while executives hurried through the hallways outside. Ethan opened the file immediately. "That is all?" he asked after a moment. Mara nodded. "There is not much to find." Ethan scanned the pages again. Clara Bennett, 27 years old. No criminal record. No debt beyond student loans. No luxury purchases. No active social media accounts. Monthly bank statements showed nearly 70% of her income disappearing through recurring anonymous payments. "Where does the money go?" Ethan asked quietly. Mara hesitated. "A nonprofit organization called St. Mary's Outreach Center." Ethan looked up sharply. "What is that?" "A small shelter and educational center in South Boston. Mostly serves low-income families and children." Ethan closed the folder slowly. "And she has been donating for how long?" Mara glanced down at her notes. "Almost 5 years." 5 years. Ethan leaned back heavily in his chair. 5 years of waitressing. 5 years of worn shoes. Thin coats. Coffee instead of breakfast. While quietly giving most of her income away. "Why?" he murmured under his breath. Mara studied him carefully across the desk. "Most people would just call that kindness." Ethan almost laughed at the simplicity of the answer. Kindness. The word sounded too small for what Clara was doing. That evening, Ethan drove himself across South Boston without informing anyone where he was going. Snow lined the sidewalks in gray piles while old brick buildings stood beneath strings of faded Christmas lights. St. Mary's Outreach Center looked nothing like the polished charity organizations Ethan occasionally funded for publicity. The building was small, old, paint chipped near the entrance steps. One window had been repaired with tape along the corner. Ethan remained inside the car for a moment watching children move around behind the frosted glass. Laughter drifted faintly through the cold air whenever the front door opened. Finally, he stepped out and crossed the sidewalk slowly. Warmth greeted him the second he entered. Not physical warmth alone. Something softer. Handmade drawings covered the walls. Tiny winter boots lined the entrance mat in crooked rows. Somewhere deeper inside the building, children laughed loudly while someone played piano badly enough to make several others giggle harder. A middle-aged nun approached him with kind, tired eyes. "Can I help you?" Ethan nodded awkwardly. "I was looking for information about donations." "Oh." Her face softened immediately. "Are you here about Clara?" Ethan froze slightly. "You know her well?" The nun smiled in a way that instantly answered the question. "Everyone here does." Ethan glanced around the room. "She volunteers here?" The woman let out a quiet laugh. "Volunteers." She shook her head gently. "Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, half these children would not have winter coats without Clara Bennett." Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest again. The nun continued softly. She pays utility bills when we fall behind. Buys groceries when supplies run low. Last spring she replaced every broken backpack before school started. Ethan stared toward the hallway where children's voices echoed brightly against old walls. Does she tell people? The nun looked genuinely confused by the question. Tell people what? Silence. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Of course she did not. She was here last night, the nun added gently. Stayed until almost midnight helping one of the little boys finish a science project. Ethan looked up. After working all day? Clara always says children should never feel poor at school. The words landed harder than any boardroom insult ever had. Ethan walked slowly toward the main activity room while the nun disappeared into the kitchen area. And then he saw them. About 15 children crowded around folding tables covered in crayons, homework sheets, and paper snowflakes. On the far wall hung dozens of drawings. Some were messy stick figures. Others showed houses, stars, or Christmas trees. But one thing appeared over and over again in uneven, colorful handwriting. Thank you, Miss Clara. Ethan stood completely still beneath the soft fluorescent lights while a little girl tugged gently on his coat sleeve. Are you Clara's friend? She asked. Ethan opened his mouth. No answer came out immediately. The child smiled brightly anyway. She says everybody deserves one good person in their corner. Ethan looked back toward the wall covered in children's drawings while quiet shame settled inside him deeper than ever before. Because for the first time in years, the most powerful man in the room suddenly felt very small. For the rest of the weekend, Ethan Cole could not stop thinking about the drawings on the wall at St. Mary's Outreach Center. Bright crayons, crooked stars, tiny handwritten messages thanking Clara Bennett for things no child should have needed help surviving in the first place. Winter coats, school supplies, milk. The memories followed him everywhere. Into board meetings, into elevator rides, into the silence of his penthouse at night. By Monday morning, Boston had turned brittle with cold again. Wind rattled against the glass walls of Cole Technologies while employees rushed through the lobby carrying laptops and paper coffee cups. Ethan stood near his office window 39 floors above the city, staring down at the frozen streets below. You are distracted lately, Richard Lawson observed while flipping through financial reports across the conference table. Ethan barely looked away from the skyline. I am listening. No, you are pretending to listen. Richard closed the folder slowly. This is about the waitress again, is it not? Ethan finally turned around. Her name is Clara. Richard raised an eyebrow immediately, but said nothing. Ethan exhaled quietly. Do you know what she does with most of her paycheck? Apparently enough to make a billionaire question his entire personality. Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. But the feeling disappeared quickly beneath something heavier. Because underneath the admiration growing inside him was another emotion he could not shake. Regret. Regret for every careless word he had spoken. Every assumption. Every moment he had reduced Clara's life to something small simply because it lacked luxury. I mocked her, Ethan said quietly. Richard leaned back in his chair. Most people at that restaurant probably have. That does not make it better. Silence settled briefly between them while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. Richard studied his friend carefully before speaking again. Then apologize. Ethan frowned faintly. You think it is that simple? No, Richard stood and adjusted his coat. But I think people who spend their lives helping others usually recognize sincerity faster than everyone else. That evening, Ethan arrived at Blackstone Grill earlier than usual. The restaurant was still preparing for dinner service. Chairs scraped softly against hardwood floors while servers folded napkins beneath warm amber lighting. Clara stood near the coffee station, writing something carefully inside her small notebook. Ethan hesitated for the first time in years before approaching another human being. Clara. She looked up immediately, surprised to see him there so early. Mr. Cole, can we talk for a moment? Clara closed the notebook slowly. Did something happen? No, Ethan glanced around awkwardly. I just wanted to apologize. Genuine confusion crossed her face. For what? Ethan stared at her quietly. The question itself unsettled him. As though Clara had already forgotten the moments he still carried with shame. For the way I spoke about you before, he said finally. I judged your life without understanding it. Clara lowered her eyes briefly before offering a small tired smile. You were not entirely wrong. Yes, Ethan answered immediately. I was. The softness in his voice caught her off guard. Ethan looked toward the windows where snowflakes drifted through the darkening city outside. I thought success meant collecting things. Money, status, control. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. You seem to measure wealth differently. Clara remained quiet for a moment. Then she leaned lightly against the counter beside the coffee machine. When I was 19, she said softly, my younger brother got sick. Ethan listened carefully. Cancer. Clara nodded once. Leukemia. The word landed gently but heavily between them. My mother had already passed away by then, so it was just me and him. Ethan noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the notebook. I had a scholarship, Clara continued quietly. Pre-med at Boston University. Ethan blinked in surprise. You wanted to become a doctor? Clara smiled faintly. I wanted to help people feel less afraid. Her eyes drifted downward for a second before she continued. But treatments are expensive even with insurance. So I left school and started working full-time. The restaurant noise around them faded into the background while Ethan listened. Did your brother recover? Clara looked toward the softly falling snow outside the window. For a little while. Silence. Heavy and respectful. Ethan suddenly understood the exhaustion he always saw in her eyes. Not weakness. Grief carried quietly for years. I am sorry, he said softly. Clara nodded gently. After he passed away, St. Mary's helped me more than anyone else did. They made sure I had food when I could barely afford rent. A faint smile touched her lips. One of the nuns used to leave soup outside my apartment door because she knew I would pretend I was not struggling. Ethan swallowed slowly. So now you help them. I guess I never stopped needing them. Her honesty carried no self-pity, no dramatic sadness, just truth spoken softly. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. You gave up medical school for your brother. Clara shrugged lightly. Family is not something you sacrifice around. You sacrifice for it. The simplicity of the sentence hit Ethan harder than any speech he had ever heard, because suddenly he remembered every relationship he had neglected while chasing expansion deals and market dominance. Every birthday missed. Every phone call delayed. Every person he assumed would simply understand. Clara glanced toward the dining room as customers began entering through the front doors. I should get back to work. Ethan nodded slowly. But before she walked away, he spoke again. Clara. She turned back. You would have made an incredible doctor. For the first time since he had known her, Clara looked genuinely emotional. Not dramatic. Just surprised in a quiet human way, as though nobody had said something kind to her in a very long time. She lowered her eyes quickly before whispering, Thank you. Then she disappeared into the growing crowd beneath the warm restaurant lights, while Ethan remained standing alone beside the coffee station, realizing that the woman he once pitied for living small had actually been carrying a heart larger than anyone he had ever known. The city grew colder as December settled fully over Boston. Morning frost covered parked cars in thin silver layers, while people hurried through subway stations with lowered heads and gloved hands wrapped around paper coffee cups. Inside Blackstone Grill, Christmas decorations slowly appeared one by one. Tiny white lights lined the windows. Evergreen garlands curled around the hostess stand. Soft piano renditions of holiday songs floated through the restaurant each evening beneath the low hum of conversations and clinking glasses. Clara Bennett noticed the decorations quietly while preparing silverware before her shift. You think they overdo Christmas in this place? Lily asked beside her while untangling strands of lights. Clara smiled faintly. People like feeling warm when it is cold outside. You always sound like a greeting card. Clara laughed softly under her breath. That is because I work for tips. But despite the joke, exhaustion still lived behind her eyes. Ethan noticed it immediately the moment he entered the restaurant that night. Clara moved more slowly than usual. Her smile remained gentle, but faint shadows sat beneath her eyes deeper than before. When she lifted trays now, there was a slight hesitation in her movements, as though fatigue had settled directly into her bones. Ethan sat alone near the window this evening. No investors. No business partners. Just black coffee and silence. Clara approached carefully with her order pad. Good evening. Ethan looked up at her. Have you slept at all this week? Clara blinked, caught off guard by the question. That is a very unusual way to greet a waitress. That is not an answer. A small amused smile touched her lips despite herself. I am fine. Ethan leaned back slightly. You always say that too. For a moment, Clara looked genuinely surprised that he remembered. Then she glanced toward the dining room and lowered her voice. St. Mary's lost one of their heating units yesterday. Ethan frowned immediately. During winter? Clara nodded once. The children are all staying in the East Wing now until they can afford repairs. How much? The question came instantly. Clara hesitated. What? How much does it cost to replace? Clara shook her head lightly. Mr. Cole, Ethan. Silence lingered briefly. Clara rarely used first names with customers. But something in his expression felt sincere now. Softer. Human. The estimate was around $12,000, she admitted quietly. Ethan stared at her. And you were trying to help pay for it yourself. Clara lowered her eyes instead of answering, which answered everything. Ethan exhaled slowly and rubbed a hand across his jaw. Clara, you cannot carry every problem in this city alone. She gave him a tired smile. I know. Then why does it feel like you were trying to? The question settled gently between them. Clara looked toward the softly glowing Christmas lights near the windows. Because I remember what cold apartments feel like. Ethan did not speak after that. He simply watched her walk away through the restaurant again, moving from table to table while quietly taking care of everyone around her as though her own exhaustion did not matter. Later that night, snow began falling heavily again. Thick white flakes drifted through the city beneath golden streetlights while customers hurried home early before the roads worsened. By 10 o'clock, Blackstone Grill had nearly emptied. Clara carried a tray of untouched desserts back toward the kitchen while the manager counted receipts near the front register. Ethan remained at his booth longer than usual, staring absently through the window at the storm outside. Then he noticed Clara speaking softly to the kitchen staff near the back hallway. Take these home, she told Miguel while dividing the desserts carefully into containers. Your sisters will like the cheesecake. Clara, you should keep some for yourself. I already ate earlier. Ethan knew immediately that she was lying. Miguel looked unconvinced too, but accepted the container gratefully. One by one, Clara handed leftovers to employees before wrapping the final small slice of apple pie in foil for herself. When she thought nobody was watching, she slipped it into her bag beside overdue utility bills partially visible through the zipper opening. Ethan's chest tightened painfully again. She was feeding everyone except herself. 20 minutes later, Clara finally stepped outside into the storm after finishing cleanup. Snow crunched beneath her worn boots while freezing wind pushed against her thin gray coat. Ethan watched from inside for exactly 3 seconds before standing abruptly and grabbing his own coat from the booth. Mr. Cole, the manager called. But Ethan was already moving toward the door. Outside, snow swirled heavily across the empty streets. Clara stood at the bus stop 2 blocks away, hugging her coat tightly while checking the transit schedule with tired eyes. The next bus was delayed another 40 minutes because of the storm. Ethan approached slowly through the snow. Clara. She turned quickly, startled to see him there. What are you doing outside? I was about to ask you the same thing. Snowflakes collected along his dark coat and silver hair while cold wind rushed between buildings. Clara looked toward the empty street. The subway closed early because of the storm. Ethan glanced down at her thin gloves. The fingertips were fraying slightly. You were planning to wait out here for 40 minutes? I have done worse. The sentence was simple, honest. Ethan looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he held out his car keys gently. I am driving you home. Clara immediately shook her head. You do not need to do that. I know. Ethan, please. The word surprised both of them slightly. Clara searched his face carefully beneath the falling snow. Whatever she saw there made her pause. Finally, she nodded once. The warmth inside Ethan's Escalade fogged the windows almost immediately after they climbed inside. Clara held her hands near the heater vents quietly while snow continued falling outside in thick white silence. Ethan glanced sideways at her after several minutes of driving. You know, he said softly, most people spend their whole lives trying to be important. Clara stared out the window at the glowing city lights. And Ethan tightened his hands slightly on the steering wheel. I think you forgot to notice that you already are. Clara looked down quickly then, blinking once as though fighting emotion she did not want anyone to see. Outside, the storm continued covering Boston in white silence while inside the warm car, neither of them spoke again for the rest of the drive. The drive across Boston felt strangely peaceful beneath the storm. Snow-covered traffic lights in soft white halos while windshield wipers moved steadily through the silence. Clara Bennett sat quietly in the passenger seat with both hands wrapped around the cup of coffee Ethan had insisted on buying from a late-night cafe along the way. Heat slowly returned to her fingers while jazz music played softly through the speakers. Neither of them seemed eager to interrupt the calm. Ethan glanced toward her occasionally during red lights. Clara looked different outside the restaurant. Smaller somehow, more fragile beneath the oversized gray coat and fading winter scarf. Yet there was still something steady about her, something unshaken. "Left here," Clara said softly after nearly 20 minutes of silence. Ethan turned down a narrow street lined with old brick apartment buildings dusted with snow. Streetlights flickered weakly against icy sidewalks while old radiators hummed behind apartment windows glowing warm gold in the dark. Ethan slowed the SUV near the curb. Clara pointed toward a modest four-story building with chipped paint near the entrance steps. "This is me." Ethan looked up at the building quietly. It was old, very old. One of the outside lights flickered weakly above the front door. Clara reached for the handle. "Thank you for the ride." But before she could step out, Ethan spoke softly. "Can I ask you something?" Clara paused. "What?" Ethan stared through the windshield for a moment before answering. "When was the last time someone took care of you?" The question settled gently into the warm silence of the car. Clara looked down at the coffee cup in her hands. Snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. "I do not know," she admitted after a long pause. Ethan swallowed slowly. Clara gave him a faint smile then, the kind people use when they do not want others worrying about them. "Good night, Ethan." She stepped out into the falling snow before he could respond. Ethan watched her climb the apartment steps slowly, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Just before reaching the door, Clara turned slightly and offered one last small wave through the storm. Then she disappeared inside. Ethan remained parked at the curb for several minutes after the building door closed. Something about the quiet loneliness of that moment stayed with him long after he finally drove away. The next morning, Boston woke beneath pale winter sunlight reflecting sharply across fresh snow. At Cole Technologies headquarters, assistants rushed through hallways preparing for the company's annual holiday gala scheduled later that evening. Every major investor in the city would attend. Politicians, executives, media outlets. The event always celebrated another year of profit growth and expansion. Normally, Ethan treated it like every other corporate obligation. But this year something felt different. "The speech is finalized," Mara said while placing printed pages across his desk. Ethan skimmed the opening paragraph without interest. Revenue milestones, international growth, market projections, empty polished language designed to impress people who already had too much. "No," he said quietly. Mara blinked. "No." Ethan set the speech down. "Rewrite the presentation schedule. We are only 8 hours from the event. Then move quickly." Mara stared at him carefully. "What exactly are we changing?" Ethan looked toward the snowy skyline outside his office windows. "Everything." By evening, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel glowed beneath massive crystal chandeliers, while waiters carried silver trays through crowds dressed in black tuxedos and designer gowns. Camera flashes lit the entrance every few seconds. Wealth moved elegantly through the room beneath soft orchestral music and champagne laughter. Clara Bennett nearly turned around the moment she stepped inside. She stood near the entrance, clutching the borrowed navy blue dress Lily had practically forced her to wear after receiving an unexpected invitation from Cole Technologies earlier that afternoon. "You are seriously not going?" Lily had demanded while helping zip the dress. "Clara, billionaires do not personally invite waitresses to charity galas every day." Clara still felt out of place now standing beneath glittering chandeliers surrounded by people who looked like they belonged on magazine covers. Her dress was simple, elegant, but modest. She kept tugging nervously at the sleeves while trying not to draw attention to herself. But attention found her anyway. Ethan noticed her the second she entered the ballroom. For a moment, the entire crowded room faded into background noise. Clara looked beautiful tonight, though not in the polished artificial way many people around them did. She looked real. Soft golden light reflected against her pale hair, while nervous blue eyes searched the massive room uncertainly. Ethan crossed the ballroom toward her immediately. "You came." Clara let out a small breath. "I almost did not." Ethan smiled faintly. "I am glad you changed your mind." Before Clara could answer, the ballroom lights dimmed slowly. Conversations softened. A spotlight illuminated the main stage where a massive screen displayed the Cole Technologies logo. Mara approached quietly beside Ethan. "It is time." Ethan nodded once before looking back at Clara. "Stay." Clara frowned slightly. "For what?" Ethan did not answer directly. He simply stepped toward the stage while hundreds of wealthy guests turned their attention forward, expecting another polished corporate speech about growth and success. Ethan stood beneath the spotlight in complete silence for several seconds after reaching the podium. The room grew still. Then he looked out across the crowd slowly before speaking. "For most of my life," he began quietly, "I believed success meant being powerful enough to never need anyone." The ballroom remained silent beneath the soft glow of chandeliers. Ethan glanced briefly toward Clara, standing near the back of the room. "I respected ambition, efficiency, wealth. But recently someone taught me that there are people in this world who measure value very differently." Clara's expression shifted immediately with confusion. Ethan continued softly. "There is a woman who works long, exhausting shifts every day while secretly feeding children before feeding herself. A woman who gave up medical school to care for her dying brother. A woman who has spent 5 years quietly keeping a struggling shelter alive without asking for recognition from anyone." Murmurs spread softly through the ballroom now. Clara stood completely frozen beneath the golden lights. Ethan's voice lowered slightly. "I once mocked her for living small." Silence. Heavy and honest. "But the truth is, she was the only truly wealthy person I had ever met." Clara's eyes filled instantly with emotion she clearly tried to hide. Around the ballroom, conversations disappeared entirely now. No laughter. No champagne glasses clinking. Just silence. Respectful silence. Ethan looked directly toward her across the crowded room. "Clara Bennett," he said gently, "thank you for reminding me that kindness is still the most valuable thing a person can give away." The ballroom remained silent for several seconds after Ethan Cole finished speaking. Not the uncomfortable silence of confusion. Something deeper. Softer. Hundreds of people stood beneath crystal chandeliers holding untouched champagne glasses while the words settled slowly across the room. Clara Bennett could barely breathe. Heat rushed into her face as every eye turned toward her. She wanted to disappear. That instinct had followed her most of her life. Stay quiet. Stay small. Do not make people uncomfortable with your struggle. But standing there beneath the golden lights, she saw something unfamiliar in the faces around her. Respect. Genuine respect. Ethan stepped away from the podium slowly and crossed the ballroom toward her while the crowd remained silent enough for footsteps to echo softly against the marble floor. Clara lowered her eyes the moment he stopped in front of her. "You should not have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan looked at her carefully. "Why?" "I do not help people to be noticed." "I know." That was exactly why he had done it. Clara blinked quickly, trying to steady the emotion building behind her eyes. Ethan lowered his voice gently. "You spent years making sure nobody else felt invisible." His expression softened. "I just thought somebody should finally see you too." Around them, applause slowly began somewhere near the back of the ballroom. Then another. Then another. Until the entire room filled with warm, sustained applause that echoed against the chandeliers overhead. Clara looked overwhelmed by it. Not proud. Not excited. Just emotional in the quiet, exhausted way people become when kindness finally returns to them after years of giving it away. Later that evening, long after the gala ended, snow drifted softly across the city again while Ethan stood outside the hotel entrance beside Clara beneath the glow of streetlights. Limousines pulled away one by one through the cold Boston night. Clara wrapped her coat tighter around herself. "Those people are going to forget about me tomorrow," she said softly. Ethan slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "I do not think so." Clara smiled faintly. "People like stories more than people." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "Then maybe you changed the story." The wind moved gently through the street while snowflakes settled along Clara's pale hair. She looked tired again now that the attention had faded. But peaceful too. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "I arranged something this afternoon." Clara frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan glanced toward the quiet street. "St. Mary's Outreach Center will receive a permanent endowment beginning next month." Clara stared at him silently. "The heating repairs are already covered, along with food programs, school supplies, and medical assistance for the children." Her eyes widened slowly. Ethan, no cameras, he interrupted gently. No press release. No company branding. Clara looked completely stunned. Why would you do that? Ethan smiled softly. Because somebody once helped you. Silence settled between them while tears quietly gathered in Clara's eyes again. This time she did not try to hide them. Ethan stepped closer carefully, his voice barely above the wind. You changed something in me, Clara. She shook her head faintly. No, you changed yourself. Ethan almost answered immediately, but then he stopped, because maybe she was right. Several weeks later, Boston prepared for Christmas beneath heavy blankets of snow and glowing storefront lights. The city felt warmer somehow, softer. At St. Mary's Outreach Center, children raced through hallways wearing new winter coats, while volunteers unpacked boxes of donated books and groceries. The broken heating system had been fully replaced. Fresh paint covered the old peeling walls, and near the entrance hung a small brass plaque that simply read, "For every child who deserves warmth." No company name, no billionaire signature. Clara noticed the plaque during one of her evening visits, but never asked who paid for it. Somehow she already knew. On Christmas Eve morning, Clara walked toward Blackstone Grill through softly falling snow with her usual paper cup of coffee warming her hands. Her boots were still worn, her scarf still old, yet something inside her felt lighter now. As she approached the restaurant entrance, she noticed movement across the street. Ethan stood outside a small coffee shop in a dark wool coat, watching the city wake slowly beneath the snow. The moment he saw her, he smiled. Not the polished, confident smile used in boardrooms and magazine interviews. A real one. Quiet. Human. Clara crossed the street slowly. You are up early for a billionaire, she teased softly. Ethan glanced toward the cafe window. I was told coffee counts as breakfast. Clara laughed under her breath, surprised he remembered. The sound warmed the cold morning air between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snow drifted lazily around the city, while distant church bells echoed softly somewhere across Boston. Ethan finally looked at her and asked the question that had quietly lived between them for weeks. Are you happy, Clara? She thought about it honestly before answering. I think happiness is smaller than people expect. Ethan nodded slowly. You always make simple things sound important. Clara looked toward the snowy streets, filled with strangers rushing toward holiday mornings. Maybe simple things are important. Ethan followed her gaze quietly. Then he noticed something small taped to the outside of the cafe window beside them. A child's drawing. Crooked stars. Uneven handwriting. Thank you for helping people stay warm this winter. Clara smiled softly at the drawing while Ethan stood beside her in silence. And for the first time in years, neither of them seemed in any hurry to be anywhere else. Because sometimes the people who appear to have the least are secretly carrying enough kindness to change everyone around them. And sometimes the richest thing a person can give away is simply the decision to care.